Hi, my name is Hannah Proctor. I'm the author of Burnout, the Emotional Experience of Political Defeat. And I'm really delighted to have had my book selected to be part of the Lighthouse Books Beacon subscription. Um, this is my book. Does that come out back to front? I can't really tell. It came out in April 2024. And it's an attempt to think through the psychological toll of political struggle. I had the idea for the book quite a long time ago, and partly it came from my own experiences of being proximate to different activists, different kind of organizing and different experiences of not just political defeat, but of more long-term engagement with different political campaigns and just coming up against the difficulty of sustaining momentum over long periods of time. And I'm an academic. I work at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. I'm a historian of psychiatry. And so in my academic work, I was already quite familiar with histories of the kind of intersection between theories of politics and theories of the psyche. And so I was already interested in sort of left-wing approaches to the mind. I've done some work on the history of anti-psychiatry in Britain, but I've also worked on the history of Soviet psychiatry. And so I've had a long-standing interest in understandings of psychic life that try not to think of psychological experiences as necessarily only individual ones, but that try to locate mental health in kind of broader social contexts. And so that was the kind of how I was coming at this topic. When I started writing the book, I first imagined that I would write it as a series of case studies looking at different moments or movements. And to start with, I kind of thought that I would then focus on movements or particular events that are already kind of quite established within a kind of left-wing history as of particular historical or indeed symbolic significance. And so I always thought I would start from the Paris Commune, also because the Paris Commune of 1871, I could equally have started from the French Revolution in 1789 or the Haitian Revolution in 1804, but the reason I started a bit later was really to do with my own interest in the history of psychiatry. And so I wanted to think of an event that also ties in with that history rather than going back further in time. And so, yeah, initially I imagined it would be about the aftermath of particular uprisings, revolutions, etc. So I was thinking about the Paris Commune, the sort of failed German Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, and then I thought about, much more recent things like the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, and the movements in Angola and Mozambique that were connected to that in Lusophone Africa. But as I started writing the book, I decided that actually this kind of case study approach wasn't necessarily the most effective one. And instead, I decided to focus on different emotions. And so instead, the book focuses on different concepts. And so there are 8 chapters, and those are melancholia, nostalgia, depression, burnout, exhaustion, bitterness, trauma, and mourning. Quite a depressing list, but I hope that the book isn't just about dwelling in kind of negative feelings and difficult experiences, but instead came from an impetus to try to think about how it might be possible to overcome those kinds of experiences, whilst at the same time insisting that it's important to acknowledge their importance. I think for me, I felt dissatisfied with a kind of left-wing rhetoric that would be very quick to dismiss the magnitude of psychological experience, or to say, you know, oh yes, that was really difficult, but we have to kind of keep going, we just have to move on. And while I think, you know, that's obviously important, I wanted to kind of have a slightly different emphasis and ask, well, how is it possible to make space for difficult emotions and difficult psychological experiences as they arise? And so the final chapter on mourning, you know, it starts from this famous slogan, "Don't mourn, organize," which the Joe Hill, who was an organizer for the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies in America, has this kind of famous slogan that's repeated in lots of different historical moments and movements. And you can understand why it would be a kind of important seeming, a kind of emphasis on the future and the need to keep organizing rather than to dwell on the past and to kind of sink back into sorrow. But I wanted to make the case that it's important to mourn and organize. And so in that chapter, I talk about Douglas Crimp's famous essay, Mourning and Militancy, which was written in response to the AIDS crisis in the United States. So that's talking about mourning in a very literal sense, mourning not just the defeat of a movement, but the death, literal death of people within a movement. And often the history of the left does involve contending with this kind of very literal form of mourning. And I mean, I do talk about, you know, very extreme forms of political repression, as well as more mundane forms of kind of sadness and, you know, difficult experiences that are not quite as extreme as that. And yeah, and in Mourning and Militancy, Crimp makes the argument that it's dangerous not to mourn, that for some in the movement that he was involved in, there was a kind of the urgency of the kind of political situation. It seemed kind of anathema to mourn, because mourning is sort of implicitly apolitical. But he makes the case that not mourning allowed kind of psychic wounds to fester and actually made it more difficult to organize. So it's not just that it's important on an individual level to mourn, but that it's also collectively important to kind of acknowledge the weight of these kind of psychological experiences. And I also look at an account in that chapter of the Brazilian uprisings in 2013, and a psychoanalyst called Raluca Soriano wrote a book in response to her experiences of living through and participating in those movements. And she talks about how actually the crowd on the streets can also kind of enact a kind of mourning, where they're also engaging with the past realities of kind of state repression and things like that. And so that's a slightly different understanding of mourning that comes through in her work. I think, yeah, I'll just quickly read from the very opening of the book, and that maybe will just give a sense of some of the key themes. Change is hard. Living under capitalism can be physically damaging and mentally draining. The harms it inflicts are unevenly distributed. Overturning prevailing cultural, social, and economic conditions is necessary and urgent, but change is hard. It's hard to change. People shaped by the societies they've grown up in transform in the process of trying to transform them. Breaking with habitual rhythms to organize collectively, forging solidarity with others against a common enemy, or gathering in the streets to fight injustice can alter lives forever, but struggles don't always continue. When movements are crushed, strategies fail, solidarity crumbles, energies wane, people turn on one another, or groups reproduce the oppressive dynamics of the structures they are fighting, the dejection incurred can be as psychologically profound as the elation that preceded it. Trying to reform, let alone overturn the existing state of things, can inflict its own mental wounds, especially when movements end in defeat or retreat. So my book confronts the psychological toll of political struggle, asking how activists, organizers, and revolutionaries in various left-wing groups, movements, parties, and liberation struggles have worked through the emotional impacts of their political experiences whether collectively or in isolation. I'm just going to skip forward to read a bit later in the introduction, which I think captures some of the kind of contradictions that I'm trying to think through in the book. There's lots of different contradictions. So I introduced this concept called, which I call anti-adaptive healing. Examining historical attempts to address the psychological toll of political struggle necessitates contending with contradictory relationships between the transformative and the restorative, between revolution and healing, between rupture and repair. What I call anti-adaptive healing refers not only to the contradictory endeavour of striving to heal wounds in a wounded and wounding social reality without affirming its structures in the process, but also acknowledges the psychic damage that can be incurred by fighting to transform social reality so as to make it less psychically wounding. If political revolt can be interpreted as a deviation from a norm, then how to understand and treat the psychic suffering of rebels and revolutionaries without diagnosing political rebellion itself as a form of mental illness? So I hope that gives you a little taste of the book and some of its themes. My hope with the book was not to create a kind of exhaustive account. I've chosen quite a small number of case studies, and I'm not trying to imply that those are in any way definitive. Instead, my hope would be that people bring their own experiences and associations, that the book kind of continues to expand rather than that it remains kind of a closed object. So yeah, thank you very much.